Welcome to Dig, a history podcast. Dear listener, today's podcast is a biography of a woman that most of you have probably never heard of. We're going to be diving into the biography and the life and times of a woman named Elizabeth Oakes Smith. Elizabeth Oakes Smith was a household name in the mid-19th century. She was a journalist, she was a women's rights activist, she traveled across the country speaking on the lyceum circuit, and she was a well-known published author. Famous writers such as Edgar Allan Poe reviewed her written work and gave her raving reviews. But something happened. Elizabeth Oakes Smith was essentially erased from history.
There are a few theories as to why, which we'll get into a little bit in this podcast. But at the end of the day, her story is not unlike many other women in history, lost, forgotten, and overshadowed. Yet Elizabeth Oakes Smith left volumes of written work, allowing us to unearth her contributions to American literature and the first wave of the American women's rights movement. However, her race and class sets her apart from the millions of other 19th century women who are unaccounted for in our public records because they left no published records.
So think about that as we go through this podcast about Elizabeth Oakes Smith. She was a working to middle-class white woman who was educated and was able to write and publish literature. And yet, she is overwhelmingly forgotten. So if somebody who was essentially a household name in the 19th century is so forgotten, that really puts into perspective how the poor, working class, and particularly women of color have just simply vanished from our historical record. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
We want to thank, as always, all of our Patreon supporters, especially our fabulous auger and excavator level patrons, Lisa, Carl, Karen, Hannah, Jessica, Maria, Denise, Edward, Lauren, Colin, and Susan. We cannot thank you enough. Listener, if you are not yet a patron of this show, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that each of our episodes relies on the research and writing of other historians and scholars. I am indebted to Timothy Sherman, who has made it his life's work to resurrect Elizabeth Oakes Smith's life and legacy, and to the Elizabeth Oakes Smith Society. Sherman's latest books put some of Oakes Smith's writing into context. Elizabeth Oakes Smith Selected Writings, Volume 1, Emergence and Fame, 1831 to 1849, and Elizabeth Oakes Smith Selected Writings, Volume 2, Feminist Journalism and Public Activism, 1850 to 1854, and Volume 3 is on its way. Other scholars' work that I found helpful while writing this episode are Adam Tuchinski, Cynthia Patterson, Ashley Reed, Paula Bennett, Carolyn Wodat, and Nina Byam.
Elizabeth Oakes Prince was born August 12, 1806, near North Yarmouth, Maine, to David Prince and Sophia Blanchard. Her father was a merchant seaman and died at sea when she was just 3 years old. Elizabeth and her mother lived with her maternal and paternal grandparents. Elizabeth's mother eventually remarried another sea captain, and the family moved to other coastal towns, ending up in Portland, Maine.
Elizabeth attended various schools for girls while growing up, and she was very interested in learning. She even wanted to be a teacher herself. However, when she expressed this desire to become a teacher, her mother quickly squashed those dreams. Elizabeth was shortly thereafter married off to a man twice her age. In 1823, at the age of 16, she was married to 31-year-old Seba Smith, a writer and editor of a Portland weekly paper, the Eastern Argus. Her name changed then to Elizabeth Oakes Smith.
Oakes Smith seems to have resigned herself to her fate, as society didn't really allow her any other options. Later, writing in her autobiography, she wrote bitterly about her lost childhood, alluding to her underdevelopment both physically and mentally when she was married. She wrote, quote, "I was well, but not fully developed, for I grew nearly 2 inches afterwards," meaning after the marriage. Mr. Smith was almost twice my age, wore spectacles, and was very bald. I was so foreign to all this, so unfit for the occasion. I, a dreamy, imaginative, undeveloped child, whose head was not furnished with a fiber of the actual.
Now, mind you, she's writing these words many years after the fact, writing as a grown woman, looking back on her stolen childhood and her wedding to, in her eyes, an old man.
Right, yeah.
However, this was the way things were at the time, and she went along with what society expected of her. Both Elizabeth and Seba fell into their assigned gender roles. And Elizabeth later wrote of those early years, quote, "Most conscientiously did I bend my young faculties to redeem the obligations involved in my new position. My husband was most exacting and greatly disinclined to the responsibilities of a family man. He was essentially a bachelor. Yet, having a wife, he was not disposed to allow her to let up on any point of duty." End quote. So essentially, it sounds like Seba was a pretty stern husband, expecting kind of a certain level of wifely obedience, even as he himself had no desire to create any kind of, family environment or warm home.
Oh my goodness. And that's, any of this would be a lot for a 16-year-old, but especially to marry someone who had very exacting standards of what a wife should do and should be. That must have been really, difficult.
Yeah.
Oakes Smith went on to explain how she found some modicum of fulfillment in her wifely duties through her ingrained sense of duty. She wrote, quote, "Happily, perhaps a sense of duty was my weak point. Thousands of young housekeepers could sympathize with my shortcomings, and those of a poetic turn will see how carefully I folded my wings that I might not be remiss in any one home duty. The folly and sorrow was that I felt myself to be a poor weak creature, unfit for the place occupied. I had lost my girlhood and found nothing better to take its place." This experience informed her later critiques of marriage and her arguments that women should marry for love and equality rather than economic security. In her life's writings, Oakes Smith criticized traditional marriage as limiting women's potential and reducing them to property. She advocated for women to have more educational and professional opportunities beyond just being wives and mothers.
Over the next 13 years, Elizabeth Oakes Smith bore 6 sons, 4 of which survived into adulthood. Her days must have been extremely busy as she raised a house full of young boys while also overseeing the printers and apprentices who worked at the Eastern Argus and who lived within the household. During this period, she contributed poems and stories to journals that were edited by Seba. In 1833, she took over as acting editor of the Eastern Argus, while her husband was in Boston overseeing the publication of his book, The Life and Writings of Major Jack Downing.
This scenario is pretty typical of middling families during this period. Apprentices and younger unmarried workers commonly lived under the roof of their quote-unquote master, where they learned a trade while under the watchful eye of a paternal figure. In this system, women often participated in the day-to-day operations of the business while also managing the household and servants. A wife would often step into the role of manager when her husband was away or incapacitated. Although this could sometimes allow women to wield a great deal of power, it still fell under the auspices of coverture, or femme covert, which legally dictated that a woman became subsumed by her husband upon her marriage. Therefore, any contracts or transactions that she participated in were ultimately under the authority of her husband.
Oakes Smith was already a voracious reader, but she took this time of her life to dive into the works of Shakespeare, Milton, and Sir William Blackstone. Blackstone was an English jurist and is most famous for his commentaries on the laws of England, which became the best-known description of the doctrines of the English common law. The commentaries had a particularly strong influence on law in the United States. The early Supreme Court relied heavily on Blackstone's writings. Often, and especially on the American frontier, Blackstone's Commentaries was the only book available to those studying and practicing law. Blackstone included his plan for a dedicated school of law in the Commentaries, and this plan became the basis of the modern system of American law schools. So Oakesmith's understanding of the law became important in her later critiques of patriarchy.
In 1837, Elizabeth's prospects changed drastically. Seba lost most of the family fortune during the Panic of 1837 by speculating in land sales. The Panic of 1837 was a financial crisis in the United States that triggered a major economic depression, which lasted until the mid-1840s. It began when a slowing economy led investors to cause a bank run. When banks in New York City ran out of gold and silver, it started a collapse of the financial system on May 10, 1837. Banks immediately suspended payments and stopped redeeming commercial paper in specie at full value. This created a ripple across the Northeast, triggering significant economic collapse in all commercial ventures. Compounding the issue, the lack of a central bank to regulate the American economy, which you might remember President Andrew Jackson had ensured by not extending the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, was an important factor in prolonging the panic. Despite a short recovery in 1838, the recession lasted for 7 years. During the panic, over 40% of all banks failed, businesses closed, prices declined, and there was massive unemployment.
Yeah, so it's this is a major, for their generation, this was the Great Depression.
Absolutely.
To kind of put it into perspective.
Yeah.
In 1838, Elizabeth Oakes-Smith wrote and later published Riches Without Wings. This was a moralist novel that targeted the victims of the panic and favored spiritual over material wealth. That fall, she traveled with Seba to South Carolina, where he was attempting to recoup some of their losses by investing in a machine that was designed to clean seagrass cotton. And I had to look up what seagrass cotton is. Seagrass is...
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this.
I wasn't either. Seagrass is a plant that grows on the ocean floor. A lot of times you might call it algae, right? But it's like the kind of long, stringy grass that grow on the ocean floor, and that can be harvested and used as twine and material for making like baskets and rugs. So you can kind of see how somebody would want to market this to use it, right? For larger commercial things, right? But
untapped potential, right, for a
Right.
product.
It doesn't seem that wild, actually, like once I understood what it was. But unfortunately for Seba and Elizabeth, the invention proved unmarketable, and the family continued to struggle financially throughout the late 1830s and 1840s. They moved to Brooklyn in 1839 and essentially crashed with Oakesmith's cousins, and the family survived on the unsteady money both Seba and Elizabeth earned by freelance writing.
Even as finances were always a bit precarious, the 1840s was the period when Elizabeth Oakes-Smith earned a reputation as a writer in her own right. She began her career publishing under the name Mrs. Seba Smith or a pseudonym Ernest Helfenstein. I like that. However, by the mid-1840s, she was well established as a writer in her own name. Nevertheless, supporting a family of 8 was no easy task. In 1842, Oakes-Smith wrote to the editor of Graham's magazine, practically begging for work. Quote, "Heaven knows I am willing to work, to write, copy, do anything that woman may conveniently do to relieve us from this terrible anxiety. Why, I must do something. I am sure you will pardon the liberty I take, awkward in the extreme, for this is the first time I have begged for a situation." The family's money struggles were compounded by Seba's increasingly failing health. In 1843, he wrote to the publishers of a gift book he was narrating, apologizing that his prose was a month late due to his recurring illnesses.
However, the move from Maine to Brooklyn and then later to New York City was good for the Smiths' literary careers. It also provided Elizabeth with opportunities to attend lectures and events. Against the advice of her cousins, she went to see the controversial Fanny Wright speak, almost 10 years before she would launch her own public speaking career. Fanny Wright was a vocal advocate of birth control, equal rights, sexual freedom, legal rights for married women, liberal divorce laws, and the emancipation of slaves. Wright was born in Scotland but became an American citizen in 1825. She was well connected, having been a kind of ward of the Marquis de Lafayette. Nevertheless, Wright's increasingly radical takes on the abolition of slavery, on working men's rights, and of course feminism made her a radical by the mid-19th century. But the ability to engage with radicals like Wright was an important step in Elizabeth Oakes Smith's political education.
Oakes Smith's need to support her family was ever present. She published the novel The Western Captive in 1842, and it's important to highlight what she wrote in the book's dedication. She says this book is dedicated to, quote, those of her sex, whom the desire for utterance or the necessities of life have called from the sanctity of womanly seclusion. Scholar Nina Baim sums it up this way, saying that her, quote, dedication presents writing as a call and makes a woman's desire for utterance equal to her need to earn money.
The book itself, so The Western Captive, uses the genre of Indian captivity narratives to explore issues of women's freedom and identity in 19th century society. Oakes Smith undermined the traditional captivity narrative by depicting Margaret Durand, the white female protagonist, as a woman who found freedom and self-fulfillment among her Native American captors, as opposed to viewing her captivity as something to escape from. In The Western Captive, the heroine, Margaret, is adopted by an Indian tribe as a child and grows up to enjoy a position of respect and independence that would have been denied to her in white society. Margaret declares, quote, the swaying reed is beloved by the tribe, and none may dare to take her away, meaning herself. The quote goes on to say, she is her own mistress and goes and comes at the bidding of none, end quote.
Scholar Carolyn Wodat highlights parallels between Oakes Smith's own life experiences and those of the Western Captive's fictional heroine, Margaret. Oakes Smith felt stifled by the expectations placed on women in 19th century American society. In The Western Captive, she imagined alternatives where women could develop their talents and identities outside of marriage and domesticity. However, Wodat also points out the complexities and contradictions in Oakes Smith's depictions of Native Americans. While her white heroine found freedom among Native Americans, the Indian women were portrayed as jealous rivals or domestic drudges, thus reflecting both a critique of white patriarchal society and problematic racial stereotypes of the time.
Elizabeth Oakes Smith's most popular piece of literature was also published in 1842. The long-form poem, The Sinless Child, was published as a serial in January and February of 1842. It was then repackaged and published in a collection, The Sinless Child and Other Poems, in 1843 to great commercial success. The poem explores themes of innocence, spirituality, and the relationship between humanity and the natural world. The poem's protagonist, Eva, is portrayed as a child with an almost supernatural ability to commune with nature and understand divine truths. Her purity and goodness are contrasted with the corruption and materialism of the adult world around her. Eva has a special affinity for animals and plants, and she is able to perceive spiritual realities that are hidden from others. The poem suggests that Eva's sinless nature, which could be defined as either her virginity or her childishness or even a spiritual, ethereal quality, allows her to maintain a connection to the divine that most people lose as they grow older. The work reflects many of the ideals of the Transcendentalist movement that was influential in American literature at the time. Oakes Smith's Eva is also the prototype for Harriet Beecher Stowe's Eva in Uncle Tom's Cabin.
After the success of The Sinless Child, she ceased to sign herself Mrs. Seba Smith, adopting instead the name Elizabeth Oakes Smith. Later, she changed her son's last name to Oakes Smith, all one word, which is pretty progressive and just more insight again into her critique of patriarchy. Plus, Oaksmith is kind of a kick-ass last name.
Yeah, definitely.
She continued to write short stories and poems for popular magazines and gift books. What's a gift book?
Yeah, I think there are like these little illustrated books that, yeah, like you would give as a gift.
Like collections almost?
Yeah, like
that makes sense.
like those Taschen books. I kind of like, that's kind of what I think of immediately. You know what I'm talking about? Like they're like little picture books or little
yeah, I'm imagining them like as compendiums of things.
Yeah, different
like that you would give to someone.
Right.
That makes sense.
So like, here's a gift book of writings about motherhood, or
right, like Chicken Soup for the Soul.
Right.
Anyway, she also published her second novel, The Salamander, an allegorical story about iron workers in the Ramapo Valley in 1848.
By the time Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and others made the call for the Seneca Falls, New York Women's Rights Convention, Elizabeth Oakes Smith was already a household name, known for her prolific writing and, of course, her poem, The Sinless Child. Oakes Smith did not attend the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, although some places on the interwebs say she did. And just to make sure, I emailed Timothy Sherman just to double check, because he's the expert on Oakes Smith. And yeah, he assured me that there is no evidence that Oakes Smith attended. And he did remind me that she was not part of that kind of circle of abolitionists that were central to Seneca Falls. So
it would
makes sense.
It would seem sort of out of the blue for her to be there in a way.
I mean, she was already she's in New York City at that time. So, I mean, that's 6 hours away today.
Right.
So that would be like a really long drive for her then. So yeah, but there are places like even on the New York Public Library who hold some of her archives. They say that she was there. So
that's so weird.
I just wanted to double check. And, and I kind of went down a rabbit hole too, because there are 100 signers of the Declaration of Sentiments. And there is a signer that is Elizabeth D. Smith.
Oh.
And
like the D could be an O?
Yeah, and there's no like explanation of who this Elizabeth D. Smith is. I couldn't really find anything, so I was like, maybe,
Oh, weird.
Anywho, so that's maybe a rabbit hole for another day. But like Sherman says, like there is no evidence that she was there. She would have talked about it in her autobiography.
Oh, sure,
if she had
right.
been there. So it's 99.9% that she was not there. But again, just a neat little question.
Definitely.
Right. So anyway, so I just wanted to kind of clear that up. So she's not attending the 1848 Seneca Falls, but she did attend the 1850 Women's Rights Convention that was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. And she was at the 1852 meeting in Syracuse. So she was no stranger to the major women's rights movement. When she spoke at the 1850 Worcester meeting, she suggested that the women's rights movement create their own newspaper and publicity apparatus so that the women who were actually involved in the movement could speak to the public directly, not, be dictated through male newspaper journalists and things like that.
Oakes Smith first articulated much of her feminist thinking through a series of articles in Horace Greeley's New York Tribune in 1851. She asserted that women should have the same rights as those proclaimed for men by the Founding Fathers. She argued that the world needed the action of what she called woman thought for two major reasons. First, like many of her contemporaries, she attributed to women feelings of humanity and an understanding of suffering that made them better at analyzing the evils that surrounded them. Second, she was concerned that, quote, the majority of women in society are suffering in the absence of wholesome, earnest, invigorating subjects of thought, expending themselves on trifles and fretting themselves and others for lack of employment. Basically, she's saying there that women were wasting away because they had nothing of substance to keep their minds sharp. Instead, she promoted the value of labor and encouraged women to assert their rights before or instead of marriage to pecuniary independence, like financial freedom, as a means of enhancing their self-esteem and developing their own abilities.
She addressed a range of topics that included physical activity for women, women's legal parity with men, increased educational opportunities for women, equity in marriage, and even women's right to the vote. She exhorted women to take a woman's view of life, to look into their own needs and thoughts for the truth instead of accepting men's opinions and viewpoints, and to, quote, reject the hardiness of materialism which the masculine mind engenders. And so just to kind of, make that a stronger point, like she's not saying that men and women are the same.
Right,
She's very
right.
much, in the mind of this 19th century, separate spheres, women are different than men. Women have certain innate kind of compassionate values that men do not, right? So she's still working within that kind of paradigm.
Right, right. She went on to attack the lack of equality in marriage, and she criticized the conditioning of females to believe in marriage as the only acceptable life for women. She questioned why it was okay for a man to be single, but every woman must marry if she is able. She asked why a girl, quote, must give up the name so dear and sweet to her girlhood, must merge her being, be absorbed and annihilated in marriage, be an extinct world, a gone-out soul. This was essentially a critique of coverture, and it spoke to her own experience of being married at 16. That's a really powerful phrase, annihilated in marriage.
To be annihilated, to be an extinct world, a gone-out soul.
Yeah.
Like
that's a really powerful critique of marriage.
Yeah. To promote reform, Oak Smith put forth the concept of noble womanhood as kind of an alternative to the idea of true womanhood. Noble women were intellectual, spiritually enlightened, and dedicated to improving society. While still endorsing some gender differences, this concept encouraged women to be active in public life and social reform movements. And here I want to read you at length some of the remarks that she made to the National Women's Rights Convention at Syracuse, New York, in September of 1852, because honestly, these words are pretty radical in my opinion. So she begins her speech with, quote, "My friends, do we realize for what purpose we are convened? Do we fully understand that we aim at nothing less than an entire subversion of the existing order of society, a dissolution of the whole existing social contract?"
Wow.
End quote. Right?
Yeah.
So that's some big words, right? The entire subversion of the existing order, a dissolution of the existing contract, like that's effing radical.
She's calling for revolution, right?
Yeah.
I love that. That adds such important nuance, I think, to the women's rights movement of this period. That, like, I'm just thinking back on conversations I had with students all this past semester when I was teaching the U.S. Women's History seminar, and one of the things that we kept kind of coming back to was their sort of like disappointment in the radicalness of the mid 19th century women's rights movement. And they're thinking, especially we played the game Greenwich Village, and this is a big subject of that game, is that, like, for students today, especially those kind of radicalized by the protests that were happening at the moment that they were playing, they're like, well, obviously the people like Elizabeth Gurley Smith, like, they are the radicals, right? And like the old fashioned, mid 19th century suffragists, like, they weren't radicals. They were just like normie women who wanted the right to vote, and that's not radical. And this is a really good reminder that like they were radical, and that just changes over time. Their goals change over time, right?
Right. I mean, it's radical for the time because, I will kind of say, like, yeah, she calls for this revolution, but then, as you're going to hear in a minute, her idea of essentially revolution is let's form a newspaper.
Right. Yeah.
So she's not saying we're gonna like start pulling down,
right,
the White House brick by brick or whatever.
Right.
I mean, she's not calling for that kind of revolution, but she is saying that the social order does not work, and we have to change it.
Yeah.
So, you know, take that for what you will.
Yeah. No, I think it's really an important reminder. So then she goes on in this speech to talk about her idea about, as Elizabeth alluded to, a women's rights newspaper, building on the idea that she had proposed at the Worcester Convention 2 years earlier. She says this: "Let us pledge ourselves to the support of a paper in which our views shall be fairly presented to the world. At our last convention in Worcester, I presented a prospectus for such a paper, which I will request hereafter to be read here. We can do little or nothing without such an organ. We have no opportunity now to repel slander and are restricted in disseminating truth from the want of such an organ. The Tribune and some other papers in the country have treated us generously, but a paper to represent us must be sustained by ourselves. The newspaper and the lecture room have become greater than the pulpit, more effective in stirring up human hearts to great movements. Let us pledge ourselves to the support of these and in the work in which we are engaged. We must work more diligently than in times past, that our sons may be fitted to nobler humanitarian purposes. Yes, we have looked to the pulpit, but in vain. And now, in spite of St. Paul, we must ourselves preach." Ooh, I love that. "We have looked to legislation, and now we must vote."
Yeah. So, all right. So here she's promoting the idea of a newspaper and essentially a press bureau for, for the women's rights cause. But then she ends it with, "and now we must vote," right? There's no tiptoeing around here. Right. The vote is the answer. Yeah. But she knows it's an uphill battle because she is well aware of women's, and in this context, she's talking about white women's status as economically dependent on their husbands and fathers. She goes on to say, quote, "And yet I say this to a race of beggars, for women have no pecuniary resources," right? They have no financial resources. "Well, then we must work. We must hold property and claim the consequent right to representation or refuse to be taxed." Right. So here's the argument that so many suffragists were adopting: no taxation without representation. Give us the vote or we will refuse to be taxed. Right.
Something else about Oak Smith's speech at the Syracuse Convention, just in case you're thinking, well, I've never heard of this woman. She must not be that important. A majority of the convention wanted Elizabeth Oakes Smith to preside as the president of that meeting. However, Susan B. Anthony thought that Oak Smith was dressed too fashionably to represent the cause, and her nomination was withdrawn. Oh, my goodness. Lucretia Mott was appointed as the president, and Paulina Wright Davis and Elizabeth Oakes Smith were nominated as vice presidents. Side note, apparently Oakes Smith was known for being a really fine dresser. In a letter from 1851, Paulina Wright Davis refers to women like Elizabeth Oakes Smith, whose beauty will, quote, "give grace and elegance to our movement." Later commentators also commented on her fine dress and form. That reminds me of, what's her name? Who's the beauty of the later women's suffrage movement? The one who writes.
Oh, Inez Milholland.
Inez Milholland.
Yeah. I mean, this is it's so important to highlight too, because nothing has changed, right? Women speaking out today, like, you can't be too big. You can't be too small. You can't be too fancy. You can't be too plain.
Right.
You can't, it's never enough. Right. And unfortunately, a lot of that criticism comes from other women. Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
And so here we have Anthony saying, Paulina and Elizabeth have shown up to this meeting and they're showing their necks and their wrists, like, oh my God. And, and other people at the meeting are saying to Susan B. Anthony, like, not everybody dresses like a Quaker Susan, right?
Right. Yeah.
They end up kind of capitulating and, but we see, right, there's still kind of like a second prize, right? Yeah. Elizabeth Oakes Smith is one of the vice presidents of this meeting, right? So I included that for a number of reasons. One, to show kind of how dress reform was also really an integral argument that's going on at the time, right? You have Elizabeth Bloomer and the kind of pants question going on. You have these suffragists or these women's rights advocates being caricatured in papers as, manly
Right.
and ugly, right? But yet you can't be too pretty, right?
Right.
Or else that goes to the complete other direction. So it's just this like tightrope that is never going to work,
Right.
right? You can never be perfect in this situation. It's like an unwinnable issue,
Right.
essentially.
It also says to me, like, we don't recognize the name Elizabeth Oakes Smith necessarily, like the average person doesn't. But at the time, the fact that there was significant push for her to be the president of this convention
Right.
really says that, like, whoa, like it really underscores the point that you made at the beginning that, like, she has just disappeared for some reason, right? She was critical at the time.
Everybody knew
Right,
her, right?
yeah.
Whether you were a feminist or not, you knew her because she was a famous writer.
Right, right.
She wrote The Sinless Child and all of these other novels
Yeah.
and writings and things like that. Like, you didn't open up, Godey's Ladies Book or any other magazine without seeing something written
Right.
by Elizabeth Oakes Smith,
Yeah.
right? Like, you knew her, who she was, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so from here, she starts speaking publicly about women's rights on the Lyceum circuit, beginning around 1851. And she is one of the first women to regularly speak on this circuit. She traveled throughout New York State. She traveled throughout New England. She heads west out to St. Louis and Chicago. And so from 1851 to 57, she is presenting her feminist views to Lyceum lectures, throughout the country, essentially. So again, right, like speaking to her popularity, right?
Absolutely.
Like people are going to see her because they're like, oh, dude, like Elizabeth Oakes Smith is in town. Like we want to go hear her, even if we don't necessarily agree with what she's preaching. Like we want to go see her because she's a celebrity.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
As both poet and feminist, she demanded freedom for individuals to respond to their inmost nature. Following Margaret Fuller in her emphasis on the unique qualities of the woman mind, she insisted that women's latent powers must be freed from the restrictions and false standards imposed on them by men. Though Oakes Smith idealized women as ethereal and inspired creatures, she found the key to their emancipation in economic independence. Her personal experience of sudden poverty had taught her the importance of having the means for self-support, and she urged that every woman have a trade.
Oakes Smith harshly criticized the legal subordination of women in marriage, likening wives to household chattels. Yet, as scholar Adam Tuchinski argues, Oakes Smith was adamantly against liberalizing divorce laws. She believed indissoluble marriage was necessary to protect women and children from the ravages of individualism and the market economy. She saw the family as a bulwark against market values, even as she criticized its patriarchal elements. So Oakes Smith's complex position really reflected kind of broader tensions in American society and grappled with how to balance equality and morality with the realities of competitive individualism. And it just shows how these questions about marriage and property and love were complex and how many of the arguments didn't neatly fit into, what we would kind of consider a liberal or conservative category. There was a variety of perspectives within early feminism on issues of marriage reform.
Elizabeth Oakes Smith became interested in spiritualism and her own clairvoyance and published 2 novels dealing with spiritualist subjects. She continued writing through the 1850s, publishing a book about spiritualism entitled Shadowland, or The Seer. Shadowland is an extended account of Smith's dream world. In this book, she speaks, sometimes in dreams and sometimes as a cognizant author, on religion, astrology, and other various topics. Sometimes as narrator, she also channels other unnamed presences. While her earlier work, The Sinless Child, predates the formal spiritualist movement, it does share some thematic connections and could be seen as a precursor to some spiritualist ideas. Eva's innocence that allowed her to access spiritual truths was similar to spiritualist notions of certain individuals being more attuned to the spirit world. This suggests that some of the ideas in The Sinless Child may have been early expressions of concepts she would later more fully explore through spiritualism.
In 1854, she published 2 novels, Bertha and Lily, which presented many of her women's rights positions and also explored spiritualist themes, and another novel, The Newsboy, about the exploitation of child labor in New York City.
Additionally, Oakes Smith edited and wrote for Seba's new ventures in journalism, including the Weekly Budget magazine and Emerson's Monthly magazine. In 1859, Elizabeth and Seba moved to a new home on Long Island, which they named The Willows. Elizabeth continued to write, producing several adventure tales for the new dime novels of the 1860s and contributing occasional letters and articles to periodicals until her death in 1893.
So we get back to this question. Why does she disappear, right?
Right.
So here are kind of a few ideas that we'll throw out and, chew on them how you will, right? So some scholars say that Elizabeth Oakes Smith isn't well known because her writing style fell out of favor, right? That essentially she was part of this kind of high sentimentalism. Mm-hmm. But plenty of her contemporaries are still very well known, so I don't quite buy this one. Scholar Paula Bennett argues that poets and writers like Oakes Smith fell out of favor when American women poets, starting in the late 1850s, began to break away from the high sentimentalism of earlier generations, and they instead used their poetry to challenge idealized notions of womanhood, marriage, and domesticity. Bennett labels Oakes Smith as part of an early generation of these high sentimental poets that the later writers were reacting against. She notes that Oakes Smith was keenly aware of the oppressive potential within 19th century marriage. And, obviously, as we've seen throughout this episode, she experienced severe marital difficulties herself. However, Bennett argues that Oakes Smith and her contemporaries still wrote within the sentimental discourse of their era, retaining the home or the realm of sensibility as the locus of unimpeachable power for women. And this contrasts with the more openly critical stance of the later poets that Bennett is focusing on. Now, just to kind of throw in my own 2 cents here, that's kind of one of the themes in my book that I just published, mm-hmm. called The Sentimental State, mm-hmm. right? That no, these sentimental ideals did not go away, and that they did not fall out of favor the way scholars like Bennett are saying, right? But that they continued on. They just kind of continued on in different forms, mm-hmm. right? But that those elements of sentimentalism still really carried on into the 20th century. So I don't particularly agree with this argument, but I can see the merits.
Yeah. So this can be part of it. But plenty of Elizabeth Oakes Smith's contemporaries are still well known. So this doesn't explain the complete forgetting of one of the most popular writers of the 1840s, right? So perhaps it was because she stuck her neck out for women's rights. Though reviewers praised her ladylike appearance as well as her oratorical skill on the lyceum circuit, this unfeminine entry into the public arena alienated some of her more conservative literary friends. Her increasing outspokenness for the inequalities within marriage and patriarchy in general were undoubtedly too radical for many of her blue-blooded readers.
Right, but again, plenty of other women were speaking just as loudly as she was, right? So, why is she forgotten? Another issue that worked to erase her importance as both a writer and as a feminist was a scandal involving her family during the Civil War. In the 1850s, Appleton Oakes Smith, so one of Smith's sons, entered the shipping industry, and he acquired several vessels. He became entangled in General William Walker's filibuster expeditions in Nicaragua, and he even served as secretary in Walker's self-proclaimed government and aided in supplying Walker's small military force. Essentially, they're trying to cause a coup in Nicaragua, kind of a la Hawaii or Panama or something like that, right?
After Walker's failed attempt to gain U.S. recognition and subsequent expulsion from Nicaragua, evidence suggests Appleton began using his ships to aid the Confederacy, at least in weapons smuggling, if not slave transportation. Appleton was apprehended on Fire Island, New York, in December 1861 and charged with outfitting a ship for illegal African slave transport. With President Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus in place, Appleton was swiftly imprisoned and later found guilty. Oh, Appleton, this is not a good look.
No, it really is not. So the situation placed the entire family in a precarious political and social position. Speaking lightly, right?
Yeah.
Consequently, the Civil War period proved particularly challenging for Oakes Smith's family, who maintained Appleton's innocence throughout. Nevertheless, it wasn't a good look, and most evidence pointed to Appleton at least breaking the law and at most being a traitor to the Union cause.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Appleton was either released or possibly escaped from prison and was exiled in London. Oakes Smith spent many years trying to get Appleton's record cleared. She met with President Andrew Johnson and requested a pardon for Appleton, but was refused. And not for nothing, but that's really saying something when Andrew Johnson...
Right, that Andrew Johnson won't give you
a pardon.
Amen.
Because that dude
totally
sucked. Anyway, she later secured one from Ulysses S. Grant. That is an inversion that I was not expecting. You'd imagine that of the two people.
Right. Grant would be like, hell no.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But more time had passed by that point. So,
well, exactly. So, through all of this and after the war, the family's fortune continued to fall. Oakes Smith's son, Edward, died of yellow fever in 1865. Seba, her husband, died in 1868. Another one of her sons drowned in 1869. She ended up having to sell the Willows in 1870, and she moved in with her son, Alvin, and his family. And then in 1879, Apple's daughters, so some of her granddaughters, also drowned in a boating accident.
Jeez.
So I'm sorry, maybe you move away from the coast. Her father died, drowning.
Yeah.
2 of her son dies drowning. 4 of her granddaughters. It's awful.
That
awful.
is awful.
So yeah, I think I would move away from the coast if I was that family.
Yeah,
but
really.
anyhow, that's me.
Goodness gracious. Appleton moved back to the States after his pardon, and Oakes Smith split her time living with Appleton in North Carolina and with Alvin in Long Island. In 1879, she spoke at the 11th National Women's Suffrage Convention in Washington, D.C. She continued to write poetry and began an autobiography that was ultimately never published. She also turned towards Catholicism in her later years.
Luckily, we still have a lot of her writing, and we also have a diary from her later years. In reflecting on her life's writing and reflecting on her fading importance in literary circles, she wrote in her journal that so much of her autobiographical writing reflected not her life, but, quote, the promise of her childhood. Ouch. So, as much as I hate to sum up a life based on singular events or past events, it's really hard for me not to see how her early marriage to Seba and the shock of being pulled out of childhood and married to an older man affected her the rest of her life.
Right.
And then, of course, the trauma that the Panic of 1837 inflicted on her, setting her on this kind of lifelong course of having to support a large family through her own writings, right? So although Seba did have some literary success in his own right, it seems that he was never really able to support the family well. And so all of these personal experiences really seem to have shaped her view on women's position in marriage and women's necessity of having their own work and their own money, even as she believed that liberalized divorce laws were not the answer.
Yeah.
And so in that way, she was really kind of leaning into the spiritualist understanding of marriage, that men and women should be equal partners in marriage and that they should have a soul connection, right? That there should be a love connection. And that soul connection is something that I get no sense she felt for Siba, nor him for her.
Right. These life experiences definitely influenced her critique of patriarchy. However, in her speech to the Syracuse Women's Rights Convention, she was clear that she wasn't working for women's rights to improve her own life. She realized it was too late for her. She knew that she was doing it for future generations. She told the audience there in 1852, quote, "If we have private griefs, and what human heart in a large sense is without them, we do not come here to recount them. The grave will lay its cold honors over the hearts of all here present before the good we ask for our kind will be realized to the world. We shall pass onward to other spheres of existence, but we trust the seed we shall here plant will ripen to a glorious harvest. We see the end from the beginning and rejoice in spirit. We care not that we shall not reach the fruits of our toil, for we know in times to come it will be seen a glorious work."
Yeah. I mean, it's really beautiful, right?
Yeah,
She's saying everybody in this room, will be cold and dead by the time that these seeds that we're planting here in 1852 will ripen, right?
Yeah.
But I love how she says if we have private griefs and what human heart in a large sense is without them, like
Right.
You can see why people loved her writing, right?
Absolutely.
It's very it paints a beautiful image in your head, right?
It does, and it really speaks to, and maybe this was because it was drawn from her own experience, it speaks to sort of the experiences that other women were having in a way that I'm sure that helped them to feel seen in a way and acknowledged, right?
Yeah. So and that's kind of what I wrote here at the end. I said, let us all use our private griefs to make our world a better place. Right? Yeah. That's all you can really ask, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that wisdom of knowing that in doing that, we might not see the rewards right now.
Right. But you're doing it for your daughters and your granddaughters.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for listening. And again, big shout out to Timothy Sherman and the Elizabeth Oaks Society. And just full disclosure, they are funding some research of mine. I'm going to be going to the University of Virginia this summer to look at Elizabeth Oaks Smith's archives that are held there. So this is probably not the last time you'll be hearing me talk about Elizabeth Oaks Smith.
That's great, though.
Yeah, I'm working on a book kind of as a follow-up to our Spiritualism's Place book that is coming out in October, which is linked all over our website, so go check that out. And I'm doing kind of a follow-up on more of these suffragists who were also spiritualists. So, of course, Elizabeth Oaks Smith is going to have a much larger place in that follow-up book. So this will not be the last time I'll be talking about her.
And I think that's great. I do not know much about her at all, and so I think I'm delighted that that she's getting the attention that she deserves.
Amen, sister.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. You can find all of the show notes, including the full bibliography and footnotes for each episode, and a transcript for each episode on our website. That is digpodcast.org. On our website, you will also find, if you're a teacher or an educator, you'll find a for teachers section of our page, which includes lots of different ways that we use episodes in the classroom, including some full lesson plans that we are really proud of. If you are teaching in a state or a location where you are, facing some challenges in how you present certain topics in the classroom, please reach out to us, and we would be happy to help sort of you think through how you might still be able to use this in your classroom. Not all of those lesson plans will probably work for you. We are on Instagram. We are on TikTok. We are on Facebook. We still have a Facebook group called Dig History Pod Squad. We would love to have you be part of. And most importantly, our book is coming out in October, and it is available for pre-sale, and you should absolutely pre-order it. We would be so delighted. We are running a a virtual book club right now. So you can sign up for that. I believe the signups for that are still on our website. They're also on our Facebook and all over the place. We would love to have you take part. If you pre-order our book or if you make a donation to certain charities, we will enter you into our virtual book club and you'll get to talk to us about our book. I think that's it.
Leave us a 5-star review, please.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Give us a good review in all the places where one might review us. Right. We would love that.
Thanks so much for listening.
Yes, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
This podcast was produced by the historians of Dig, Elizabeth Garner-Mazurek, Sarah Hanley-Cousins, Marissa Rhodes, and me, Avril Earls. Thanks for listening.
The poem falls New York women's while still the poem I can't say poem.
It's fine.
The poem,
it's just how you say
it.
It doesn't let listeners deal with it. She argued that the word, oh my God. Sometimes as narrator, she also oh my God. In her life's writings, Oakes Smith criticized traditional marriage. Whoa. Oh my God, why can't I speak? However, her race and class sets her apart from the millions of other 19th century women who were
clean seagrass. During this period, she contributed poems. Sorry, I have to say it right. During this period, she contributed.
I'm sorry. I was trying to make sense of what happens. Can I just wait for 1 second?
Yeah, it keeps going.
No,
Well, the story continues here.
I know. I have a question though.
Oh, okay.
Lincoln wasn't president in December 1860.
I see. I see.
No, I'm wrong. Wait, no, I'm wrong. I'm sorry. I'm wrong. No,
Well, when does he suspend habeas corpus?
Exactly. I'm sorry. I was thinking December 1860. This was my fault. Okay. Sorry.
Right, but essentially aren't they trying to kind of overthrow the Nicaraguan government and create an American controlled state essentially?
Yeah, as far as I understand it.
Okay, yeah. So
seems like a big deal.
Seems like a big deal, right? But then also we, conveniently forget how we got Hawaii and
right.
Why we controlled the Panama Canal for so
absolutely
long. So,
yeah, exactly.
or the Philippines or any number
right.
of
it's wild,
islands.
but it's wild because of the timing.
Right.
Like if it happened 50 years later, we'd be like, oh yeah, that's just it's just how it goes.
It's just part of the yeah. Though that is actually interesting. It's like we really should be pushing back that kind of timeline of American imperialism.
Yeah.
Right? Like we tend to start it with the Spanish-American War. Well,
yeah.
I guess maybe with the 1848, like the Mexico-American War. So I don't know. Anyway,
yeah.
I'm now just talking in circles. Go ahead.
But it would be interesting. It'd be a good episode. Anyway,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.